Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Deutsches Requiem, is a bit enigmatic when you're reading it through for a couple reasons that we'll talk about. But I think the key to it is partly in the philosophical authors and matters that are being referenced in it. So it's written from the perspective of a condemned and unrepentant Nazi subcommandant of a prison camp, a concentration camp. His name is Otto Dietrich zur Linde, and the first paragraph is him essentially recounting his great predecessors, who he'll talk about, at least in part, a little bit later in the story. And he's going to say that I have no desire to be pardoned, right? He's confessed his guilt, and he says, during the trial, I did not speak. To explain myself would have been to put obstacles in the way of the verdict and made me appear cowardly. Now things have changed. On this night that precedes my execution, I can speak without fear. Fear of what? Not bodily harm, but of holding things up, of screwing things up. He says, I have no desire to be pardoned. Why? Because I feel no guilt. I've done nothing wrong. And you could say, well, you've done a whole bunch of things wrong, including, as we're going to see, bringing about the death of this Jewish poet, but probably so many other things. And he says, what I want is to be understood. And why? So I think there's a clue here. He says, those who heed my words, which are about me as a person, will understand the history of Germany, right? So in me, you can get a glimpse of what happened to and through Germany. And then he says, and the future history of the world, which is where the short story is going to end, with a bunch of predictions and indeed justifications for the debacle of the fall of the Third Reich. So this is a clue because zur Linde is in some respect identifying himself with the nation and indeed something that transcends that. And this is coming in part from philosophical points of view. So he says, tomorrow I shall die, but I'm a symbol of the generations to come. So this is how he's reconciling himself to his life and his death. So he tells us a little bit about, his birth, and he says, two passions, music and metaphysics, allowed me to face many terrible years with bravery and even happiness. I cannot list all my benefactors, but there are two names I cannot allow myself to omit: Brahms, composer, and Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, the author of, among many other things, he's going to talk about the para erga and paralipomena, but we can think about world as will and representation. And then he says, to those two names, I would add another colossal Germanic name, William Shakespeare. And he says, theology held some interest for me, but I turned from that fantastic discipline and from Christianity by Schopenhauer with his direct arguments and Shakespeare and Brahms with the infinite variety of their worlds. And then he talks about two other people, Friedrich Nietzsche, who he's going to reference in terms of Thus Spoke Zarathustra a little bit later, and Spengler. Spengler is kind of a second-rate philosopher who was very, very popular at that time. He wrote, the main work about the sort of going under of the West, and a lot of people are still interested in that today. Usually, if somebody's interested in Spengler, you kind of know where they're coming from. Not necessarily Nazi, but probably Nazi adjacent. So he says that I wanted to free myself from an influence, and I wrote an article titled Abrechnung mit Spengler, where I pointed out that the most unequivocal monument of those characteristics the author called Faustian was not Goethe's miscellaneous drama, but rather a poem written 20 centuries ago, De Rerum Natura. And he says, I did give just due to the sincerity of our philosopher of history, Spengler, his radically German and military spirit, and this leads him to join the party. What is the party? The Nazi party, right? And why? Well, he sees in the party and in what it involves sort of an embodiment of the philosophy of the time. And he says, I didn't lack valor, but I felt no calling for violence. But I did realize we were on the threshold of a new age. And that new age, like the first years of Islam or Christianity, demanded new men. So a different kind of person. And he says, the people I had to mix with as individuals were odious or hateful to me. I didn't like my fellow Nazis, but I could look at I could look at them as being part of a high cause that brought us all together, in which we're not really individuals. And so I think, again, we see this contrast between Linde as the individual person that he is, and then this vast movement which stands for something greater, something where he can lose and find himself. So he goes on and he talks about, how they were waiting for this war. They were worried that the Russians and the English would be cowardly and not fight the war with them. And then he is involved in some riots, and he gets hit in the leg with bullets, and his leg has to be amputated. So he's in a hospital when they're invading Czechoslovakia, trying to lose myself, forget myself in the books of Schopenhauer. And he reads something there that's quite interesting. And, this is Schopenhauer, that everything that happens to a person in some way that person secretly brings about, they will in some respect. And so, he says, there's no more cunning consolation than the thought that we've chosen our own misfortunes. What unknown purpose made me seek out that evening those bullets, this mutilation? Not the fear of war. I knew that. Something deeper. Now, again, what's the leading clue here? Something deeper. It's not just me as an individual being afraid for my skin. I needed to be the instrument of something greater. And so he says, at last I understood. Living for a religion is harder than dying for it, and I'm going to be one of the people who lives for it. And he's made subdirector of the Tarnowitz concentration camp. So he says, I didn't really enjoy this, but I never sinned by omission. So he says, the coward proves himself among swords. The merciful man, the compassionate one, seeks to be tested by jails and others' pain. And here he says something, I think, very revelatory of his point of view. Nazism is intrinsically a moral act, a stripping away of the old man. Again, we see new age, new men, which is corrupt and depraved in order to put on the new. And so, in battle, you do that through showing bravery. In a concentration camp, you do that by stripping away the sin, as he's going to call it, the original sin of compassion. And where is he getting this from? He says compassion on the part of the superior man is Zarathustra's ultimate sin. And then he's going to tell us about a case where he was tempted. Now, interestingly, so this person's named David Jerusalem. That's kind of a strange name to begin with, right? David is a very important, Jewish king and, author, and then Jerusalem itself, the holy city. And we have a footnote here that says, in neither the files nor the published work of Searle does Jerusalem's name appear, nor does one find it in the histories of German literature. I do not, however, think that this is an invented figure. Many Jewish intellectuals were tortured in Tarnowitz on the orders of Otto Dietrich zur Linde, among them the pianist Emma Rosenzweig. David Jerusalem is perhaps a symbol for many individuals, right? So we don't really know, and it's a fictional character anyway. So what does he do to this poet? Well, who is this poet as he's describing him? So he was a man of 50. He had consecrated his genius to hymns of happiness. Albert Sergel, who we just saw, had compared him to Whitman, and Whitman celebrates the universe in a way that's general and virtually indifferent. Jerusalem takes delight in every smallest thing with meticulous and painstaking love. He never stoops to enumerations or catalogs. And then he brings up several examples. And these are interesting because Borges is he talking about himself here in some respect? There's a poem, Say Yang, Painter of Tigers, which is virtually striped with tigers, piled high with transversal silent tigers, riddled through and through with tigers, a metaphor that Borges likes and uses in other places. And then he's got Rosencrantz Talks with the Angel, in which a 16th century London moneylender tries in vain to exculpate himself, never suspecting the secret justification for his life is that he's inspired one of his clients to create the character Shylock. Who is that? William Shakespeare. Right? So anyway, Jerusalem is gradually driven insane by what Zerlinde does in the camp and will kill himself. So this is a way in which Zerlinde can extricate any sort of compassion from his being. And he says, I don't know whether Jerusalem understood that if I destroyed him, it was in order to destroy my own compassion. In my eyes, he was not a man, not even a Jew. He'd become the symbol of a detested region of my soul. So let's pause on that for a moment. What we have here is a very interesting admission. I'm killing him. I'm bringing about his death by persecuting him, not because he is who he is, but because I identify something within me with him. And so by bringing about his death, I can root that out of myself. And so what happens next? Well, the war is going to turn against the Nazis, and he says, at first there was sort of a tonic, an exaltation in the blood, plenitude, a sort of happiness that was even in the taste of one's sleep. And then he starts recounting how things go wrong. His brother is killed. His house is destroyed. His laboratory is destroyed. Hounded across vast continents, the Third Reich was dying. Its hand was against all men, and all men's hands against it. And then he says, so I saw this happening, and I was trying to figure out why I experienced the mysterious and almost horrific taste of happiness. Why should he be happy in the defeat of the Third Reich, which he's identified himself so closely with? And he has several different musings over what he calls a contentment in defeat. Why? So the first one he tries out, because I secretly know my own guilt and only punishment can redeem me. Okay, that's a possible explanation. He rejects that. He doesn't feel guilt. Then he says, I feel a contentment in defeat simply because defeat has come, because it's infinitely connected to all the acts that are, that were, and that shall be, because to censure or deplore a single real act is to blaspheme against the universe. Okay, a little bit more plausible, a kind of fatalism, embrace of one's fate. That's not the real explanation either. What is the real explanation? He says, I tested those arguments and I came at last to the true one. Now here, the true argument is going to be something that has to do with individuals not really being what they are, but merely archetypes in a certain way. So he says, for example, it's said that all men are born either Aristotelians or Platonists, and what that means is that there is no debate of an abstract nature that is not an instance of the debate between Aristotle and Plato. Okay, so that's philosophy, right? You're either an Aristotelian or you're a Platonist. You fall into one of these two. What else? Well, the history of nations records a certain continuity. When Arminius slaughtered the legions of Varus in a swamp, he did not know he was a forerunner of the German Empire. Luther, translator of the Bible, never suspected his destiny would be to forge a nation that would destroy the Bible forever. Even his own ancestor, Christoph zur Linde, killed by a Muscovite bullet in 1758, somehow set the stage for the victories of 1914. So now it's not just about philosophy. Now it's about what we could say reality. In reality, everybody is a kind of type. But some types are, we could say, productive. And how are they? Through a self-sacrifice. He says that Hitler thought he was fighting for a nation, but he was really fighting for all nations. Even though he attacked and abominated, it doesn't matter that his ego was unaware of this. His blood, his will knew. Okay, well that sounds like something that could be coming from Schopenhauer or from Nietzsche or from Spengler, right? There's something greater that one participates in, and that's what you're actually doing. And so he goes on and he says, the sword that we offered to the world killed us, and we're like the wizard who weaves a labyrinth and is forced to wander through it to the end of his days. Or like David, who sits in judgment on a stranger and sentences him to death, and then hears the revelation, you are that man. So he says, there are many things that must be destroyed in order to build the new order. Now we know that Germany was one of them. Germany was going to be leading the New World Order. Germany had to be destroyed. But Germany, in a certain respect, gets the last laugh because of what this is going to lead to. So he says, an implacable age looms over the world. We forged that age, we who are now its victim. What does it matter that England is the hammer and we the anvil? What matters is that violence, not servile Christian acts of timidity, now rules. If victory and injustice and happiness do not belong to Germany, let them belong to other nations. Let heaven exist, even though our place be in hell. And he's going to conclude this by saying, when I face the end, my flesh may feel fear. Me as an individual, I myself, the deep will that is represented by Germany itself, and this urge to violence that goes beyond the fall of Germany, I myself do not. And that is what the story is going to end with. Now, is this sort of a imagined justification that Borges is endorsing? I don't think so. I think that Borges is putting this forward as sort of a representation of the kinds of arguments that people who think that they're bringing about a new order might be tempted into articulating to the rest of us. So, very interesting story here by somebody who's quite erudite, can deploy philosophy to explain what's going on, not just with him as an individual, but the entirety of World War II and the world yet to come after that.